What does it take to build an entirely new science from scratch? Not refine an existing one, not contribute a chapter to an ongoing conversation, but actually define the boundaries of a field that had never formally existed before? Most people have never heard the name Wilhelm Wundt, and yet he is the reason psychology exists as a discipline at all. That quiet contradiction, extraordinary influence wrapped in mere total public obscurity, is exactly what makes Wundt worth understanding on a personal level. Because behind the founding of experimental psychology was not a dramatic visionary or a charismatic revolutionary. It was a methodical, deeply private German scholar whose inner life and daily habits were just as carefully constructed as his scientific theories. Wilhelm Maximilian Wundt was born on August 16, 1832 in Neckarau, a small village in the Baden region of what is now southwestern Germany. He came from a family with deep roots in academic and professional life. His father was a Lutheran pastor, and on both sides of his family tree he could count theologians, physicians, and professors. That heritage mattered. Growing up in a household shaped by intellectual seriousness and moral duty gave Wundt an early framework for how a life of the mind was supposed to be lived, with discipline, with purpose, and without much tolerance for distraction. His childhood was not particularly warm or socially rich. By most accounts, Wundt was a solitary boy who struggled in his early schooling. He was reportedly inattentive in class and showed little promise in the conventional academic mold, which might surprise anyone who later encountered the sheer volume of his published work. He eventually found his footing and went on to study medicine, first at the University of Tübingen and then at Heidelberg, where he earned his medical degree in 1856. But medicine, it turned out, was more of a doorway than a destination. What Wundt truly wanted to understand was not the body in isolation, but the relationship between physical processes and conscious experience. That restless curiosity pulled him toward physiology, and eventually toward something that did not yet have a proper name. The intellectual turning point in Wundt's formation came through his work as an assistant to Hermann von Helmholtz, one of the towering scientific figures of the 19th century. Helmholtz was rigorously experimental, quantitatively precise, and deeply committed to the idea that even the most complex human processes could be studied through careful measurement. Working in Helmholtz's physiological laboratory at Heidelberg, Wundt absorbed not just specific methods but an entire way of thinking about what scientific inquiry could accomplish. He began to ask whether the same experimental precision applied to nerve conduction and sensory response could be turned inward, toward perception, attention, and the structure of conscious thought itself. What distinguished Wundt from many brilliant academics of his era was not just his intellectual ambition, but his extraordinary personal discipline. He was famously systematic in his daily routines, organizing his working hours with a regularity that bordered on the monastic. He rose early, lectured, wrote, supervised students, and repeated this cycle with minimal variation for decades. Those who knew him described a man of considerable personal reserve, courteous and engaged in professional settings, but not given to the kind of easy sociability that characterized more publicly celebrated figures of his time. He did not seek fame. He sought precision. His values were formed at the intersection of German idealism and empirical science, and that combination left its mark on everything he did. Wundt believed profoundly that knowledge had to be earned through rigorous method, not inherited through tradition or constructed through speculation alone. He was impatient with vagueness, skeptical of grand philosophical claims untethered from evidence, and genuinely convinced that the human mind, as complex and elusive as it seemed, was a legitimate object of scientific study. Those convictions were not just professional positions. They were moral commitments, shaped by the Protestant intellectual culture he had grown up in and the scientific community he had been trained by. His personal life provided the stability that made sustained intellectual output possible. In 1872, Wundt married Sophie Maull, the daughter of a theologian, and by all indications the marriage was a genuinely supportive partnership. Sophie managed the domestic sphere with quiet efficiency, and Wundt was by all accounts a devoted if emotionally restrained husband and father. Their household was orderly and calm, an environment deliberately cultivated to protect his working life. This was not incidental. Wundt understood, perhaps intuitively, that the kind of work he intended to do required conditions that most scholars never managed to create. He needed time, quiet, and freedom from disruption, and he organized his personal world around those needs with the same deliberateness he brought to his research designs. That domestic architecture helps explain something that otherwise seems almost impossible. Over the course of his life, Wundt published more than 53,000 pages of original work. That is not a typo. He wrote on psychology, philosophy, logic, ethics, language, and culture, producing books and articles at a rate that left his contemporaries shaking their heads. None of that output emerged from genius alone. It emerged from a life structured around production, from a personality that found deep satisfaction in sustained intellectual labor, and from a home environment designed to support rather than compete with that labor. Understanding Wundt the man, the solitary child, the disciplined medical student, the quietly ambitious assistant to Helmholtz, the methodical husband and father, is essential to understanding how he accomplished what he did. The founding of experimental psychology was not a sudden inspiration. It was the logical outcome of a life lived with extraordinary intentionality. And that life, in all its private orderliness, is where the story of modern psychology quietly begins. Wilhelm Wundt, the professional, laboratory, ideas and lasting influence on psychology. That intentional life found its fullest expression in 1879, when Wundt formally established his experimental psychology laboratory at the University of Leipzig. The date is one of the most significant in the history of science, even if it rarely appears in popular discussions. Before Leipzig, psychology existed as a topic, something philosophers debated and physicians occasionally addressed. After Leipzig, it existed as a discipline, with its own methods, its own questions, and its own institutional home. Wundt had spent years preparing for this moment, building his theoretical foundations during his time at Heidelberg and sharpening his ideas after taking up a professorship at Leipzig in 1875. By the time the laboratory opened, he had already mapped out what he believed experimental psychology could and should accomplish. The transition from medicine and physiology into academic psychology was not a clean break, but a deliberate evolution. Wundt carried his physiological training with him and used it as the scaffold on which to build something new. He understood that if psychology was going to be taken seriously as a science, it had to adopt the tools of science: controlled conditions, repeatable procedures, measurable outcomes. The Leipzig laboratory was designed around those principles. Researchers there did not simply reflect on mental experience. They measured reaction times, studied sensory perception, and examined the structure of attention under conditions as controlled as the technology of the era allowed. It was not perfect by modern standards, but it was rigorous by any standards of its time. His core theoretical contribution rested on the concept of experimental self-observation, often translated as introspection, though that word has caused considerable confusion over the decades. Wundt's introspection was not casual self-reflection. It was a trained, systematic procedure in which specially prepared observers reported on immediate conscious experience under controlled experimental conditions. He was deeply interested in what he called apperception, the active process by which the mind organizes and integrates incoming experience, and he believed this process could be studied empirically if the methods were disciplined enough. These ideas were ambitious and not without problems, but they established a framework that gave psychology a research agenda it had never previously possessed. The scale of Wundt's scholarly output remains almost difficult to process. His foundational text, Principles of Physiological Psychology, first published in 1874 and revised across multiple editions over the following decades, served as the essential reference for anyone entering the field. But that was only the beginning. He published extensively on logic, ethics, and philosophy of science. He devoted his later career to a monumental 10-volume work called Folk Psychology, which attempted to study higher mental processes, language, myth, and social customs through historical and cultural rather than purely experimental methods. Across a career spanning more than half a century, his total written output reached that astonishing figure of over 53,000 pages. Volume alone does not make a scholar great, but in Wundt's case, the volume reflected genuine intellectual breadth and a restless drive to build a complete account of human mental life. Perhaps his most consequential professional role was as a teacher. The Leipzig laboratory attracted students from across Europe and, significantly, from the United States, a generation of young scholars who came to study with Wundt and then returned home to establish psychology programs of their own. G. Stanley Hall, who founded the American Psychological Association, trained at Leipzig. So did James Joaquin Cattell, Hugo Münsterberg, and dozens of others who became foundational figures in the international development of psychology. When you trace the institutional history of psychology departments across the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, an extraordinary number of lines lead back to Leipzig and to Wundt. He did not just build a laboratory, he trained the people who built the field. Later scholars complicated and, in some cases, significantly revised his legacy. American psychology, which developed its own strongly behavioral and pragmatic identity in the early 20th century, often misread or selectively interpreted Wundt's work, partly due to translation issues, partly due to genuine theoretical disagreement, and partly because the versions of his ideas that crossed the Atlantic were filtered through the interpretations of his students rather than direct engagement with his texts. For much of the 20th century, Wundt was either caricatured as a naive introspectionist or simply set aside as a historical curiosity. It took later historians of psychology, working more carefully with his original German text, to recover a more accurate and considerably more sophisticated picture of what he had actually argued. That recovery effort is still ongoing, and it has substantially changed how psychologists understand the foundations of their own discipline. What emerges from the full picture of his professional life is something more complex and more interesting than the textbook caricature. Wundt was not simply the man who believed you could study the mind by having people report their feelings. He was a theorist who grappled seriously with the limits of experimental method, who recognized that not all mental phenomena were accessible through laboratory procedures, and who spent the second half of his career trying to develop complementary approaches for the aspects of mind that experiments could not reach. He was imperfect, occasionally stubborn, and not always right. But he was asking the right questions, and he built the institutional structure through which later generations could develop better answers. Understanding Wundt still matters precisely because psychology's origins shape its present in ways that often go unexamined. The assumptions built into the discipline at its founding, about what counts as evidence, which questions are scientifically legitimate, how individual mind relates to social and cultural context, did not appear from nowhere. They came from choices Wundt made in a laboratory in Leipzig more than a century ago. If you want to understand what psychology is and why it works the way it does, his story is not just historical background. It is the foundation itself. And foundations, as anyone who builds knows, are worth understanding before you add another floor.